So, welcome. This is class number 3 of Dreamwork, the dreams and symbols of recovery. We This is as Patrick mentioned, it is a sequel to the Shadowwork series, and in a very kind of overarching way, this series of 4 brief sessions is a reflection of sort of what's been going on for me personally since the book was published. I'd spent 4 or 5 years just really focused on the book, and I got to a certain point in the process where I had to turn it over to the publisher, and I couldn't touch it anymore, and there was really nothing left to do, and which sort of drove me into the direction of Dreamwork and picking up some of Jung's books again and other books by Jungians that are focused on dreams and alchemy. So, and what we're looking at here in both series is really the ways in which the unconscious tends to erupt into existence, into consciousness, right? In shadow work, we often looked at the way that happens through compulsion, through the different complexes that develop and that drive us, right? Alcoholism, addiction, depression. There can be all sorts, right? That are sort of nudges or callings from the self meant to get our attention. In Dreamwork, we're looking at the way the self manifests through dreams and active imaginations, which is another word for fantasies. And so, and what we're doing here is we're using alchemical symbolism as a sort of basis for looking at these symbols. Thanks to Jung, we understand alchemy to be a literal treasure trove of modern dream symbolism. And the reason is, and we've talked about this in the previous classes, because over the course of many centuries, even millennia, the psyche doesn't change. The unconscious stays fairly static, and so that the symbols that emerge through our dreams today are the same symbols that the alchemists were toying with in up to 2,000 years ago. And hopefully today I'm going to start to really show what that looks like in terms of dream symbolism and dream interpretation. So and I want to say this: the dreams, based on the comparison with alchemy, dreams will tell us what stage of the process of the conjunctio, or the conjunction, that we are on. And so that it's very interesting once you begin to see how this works in terms of alchemy, because Jung basically shows us how we can use this to get some real clear objective feedback from the psyche about where we're at in our own process of awakening. The ego will always fool itself, right? But the objective psyche doesn't. It doesn't have. Jung says the objective psyche has no reason to either hide things or lie to a person, and so we can trust the information coming from the objective psyche. We just need to learn how to interpret it. Alchemy. So. These symbols, the thing that becomes very apparent once we learn how to see our own dreams reflected in the writings of the alchemists, is that the archetypes that these symbols represent, they seem to be living a life of their own. They're sort of on their own spiritual journey, and meaning that alchemy fundamentally is an examination of the transformation of the God image. And that was something we saw a lot in Shadow of a Figure of Light, right? That as our conception of God changes, we change. And that was something that I sort of had kind of uncovered, as I was writing Shadow of a Figure of Light, and then has become more and more kind of solidified in my own mind by doing dream work and studying alchemy. Alchemy, I want to recall this too, that alchemy runs below the surface of consciousness as dreams run below the surface of consciousness too. So in other words, alchemy is sort of the unconscious reflection of what was taking place in Christianity. Christianity and alchemy are both about 2,000 years old, so they run sort of parallel. And just like our dreams are sort of a compensation for what's taking place in the waking world, in our own spiritual program, Awake, similarly, alchemy is a compensation for what the ecclesiastical system of transformation lacks. And if you were with us through Shadow of a Figure of Light, we made a pretty big deal about that, for example, the Christ image itself is an incomplete image, right? It's hyper-focused on the light. Meanwhile, the darkness was diminished. And so alchemy then seems to try to set that imbalance in proper relation. We've talked about the myth of Sophia. I introduced the myth of Sophia last week through a poem that I wrote through active imagination called God's Folly. That is the myth of the divine feminine trapped in matter. And to just remind everyone, the alchemists had taken it upon themselves to free this energy or this spirit, the world soul. Their whole goal was to free the world soul from matter. Jesus had come only to save humans, and he sort of left the world to the devil. The alchemists then have come sort of in response to that, to help to save the world as well, right? That's kind of one way of looking at it. So also I want to point this out. When we talk about freeing the spirit or the soul of matter, if we were to look at that from a psychological perspective, that essentially means that we're trying to free the soul from within our own bodies. In terms of being a human being, this is the matter. And so we want to sort of keep in mind that, I'm not going to go into it a lot, but that the instincts, right? That's where that soul, according to the alchemists, is trapped in those instincts. And so by following the instincts and stuff and learning to listen to our instinctual selves, that's sort of like the next phase in this psychological development, right? The first phase is called the albedo, where it's the whitening. And that's what we sort of experience as we do the 12 steps, and we sort of have this awakening, this light experience, right? But there's something else, right? If we don't want to stop there, because and this goes back to that second surrender and the mystery of compulsion and everything, is that underneath that, God will still call for us through the instincts. And so that's kind of the psychological basis of this stuff. Jung explains that, I'm just going to read this. He says, the mystical side of alchemy, as distinct from its historical aspect, is essentially a psychological problem. To all appearances, it is a concretization in projected and symbolic form of the process of individuation. Even today, this process produces symbols that have the closest connection with alchemy. The causes that set such a process in motion may be certain pathological states, for the most part schizophrenic, which produce very similar symbols. But the best and clearest material comes from persons of sound mind who, driven by some kind of spiritual distress, or for religious, philosophical, or psychological reasons, devote particular attention to their unconscious. Think about Bill Wilson, right? It's exactly what he was doing. In the period extending from the Middle Ages back to Roman times, a natural emphasis was laid on the inner man, and since psychological criticism became possible only with the rise of science, the inner factors were able to reach consciousness in the form of projections more easily than they can today. As a result of the projection, there's an unconscious identity between the psyche of the alchemist and the arcane substance, i.e. the spirit imprisoned in matter. In other words, what Jung is telling us here is that the nature of their spiritual endeavor of the alchemists was really one of focusing on the inner man. And since they fancied themselves chemists but knew nothing about chemistry, that created sort of like a blank slate for them to project their own psychological processes into the chemicals and into the scientific, quote, scientific processes that they were tinkering with, right? And so what was revealed then was sort of this really clear projection of psychological transformation. I think that it's safe to say that we do the same thing in a way with the 12 steps, although it's a little more psychologized, right? Is that we're talking about psychic change, but we don't really know much about psychology, right? And so what we're projecting is this psychology of change, this psychology of religious experience, into the 12 steps and into the other sort of, the all of the other aspects of recovery. And that's why I think that what we have in the 12 steps is such a clear parallel to both alchemy as well as Jungian psychology. I think we're more like the alchemists though, because we're not really psychologists. That's just a conjecture. So Jung says that these myth pictures represent a dream of the human psyche on the further side of consciousness. So, and this means that often the symbols that we experience in our dreams or our active imaginations, they'll come to us long before we understand what they mean. And oftentimes we want to just let them be symbols and let them live a life of their own, right? And they're reflecting changes that are taking place behind the veil of consciousness. Then what happens is that as the ego makes meaning out of these symbols, then the unconscious is becoming and being brought into consciousness. So that's step 11, right? In a nutshell. We sought to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. Inasmuch as God is a reflection of this unconscious process, then it's safe to say we're seeking to improve our conscious contact with the unconscious, or with the parts of ourselves that we're still unaware of. I just want to read this as we kick off here. And because what we've been looking at is from my perspective, right? Like these are my dreams and my process that we're highlighting here. And so we're looking at as we look at the male and the female components of the psyche, or the masculine and the feminine, for me, the unconscious is largely a feminine component, right? That's that Sophia trapped in matter, right? Whereas the light, bright, sort of conscious aspect, the ego, the conscious dominant, that's the masculine side. This is what Jung says. But how can a man reach fulfillment if the queen does not intercede for his black soul? She understands the darkness, for she has taken her throne, the earth itself, to heaven with her, if only by the subtlest of suggestions. She adds the missing blue to the gold, red, and green, and thus completes the harmonious whole. And so what I found in my own growth was that once I started to look for this feminine element and really try to dig it up and become, conscious of it and work with it, then there was a sort of, and we'll see this in some of the dreams that end up emerging next week. There's sort of the symbols of wholeness begin to emerge, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So the theme for today's lecture is Mercurius, and so Mercurius is in alchemical terms, he is the child of the sun and the moon. And we're going to read through this quote from Jung again. We started this quote last week, but now we're going to add the bottom section, right? Where he speaks about the journey beginning with a confrontation with the shadow, and then from there into the deeper layers of the archetypal psyche. But here we're going to add this last few lines where he introduces the concept of Mercurius into this process. This is what he says. As I have said, the confrontation with the unconscious usually begins in the realm of the personal unconscious, that is, of personally acquired contents which constitute the shadow, and from there leads to the archetypal symbols which represent the collective unconscious. This means not only bringing the conflict to consciousness, it also involves an experience of a special kind, namely the recognition of an alien other in oneself, or the objective presence of another will. Now, that's shadow of a figure of light right there, right? That's the 12 steps. It's step 1, it's step 6, it's step 4 and 5, right? It's coming to recognize the existence of an alien other within oneself. What Wilson called the alcoholic mind, right? That recognizing that we are powerless, that something inside of our own minds and our own psyches often drives us, right, to against our will. That's the whole kind of beginning phase of this process of awakening. This is what Jung goes on. The alchemists, with astonishing accuracy, call this barely understandable thing Mercurius, in which concept they included all the statements which mythology and natural philosophy have ever made about him. He is God, daemon, person, thing, and the innermost secret in man, psychic as well as somatic. He is himself the source of all opposites, since he is duplex and capable of both. This elusive entity symbolizes the unconscious in every particular, and a correct assessment of symbols leads to direct confrontation with it. Now, Jung tells us that the constellation of the conflict of opposites is accompanied by the recognition of the presence of another alien will, the presence of the autonomous psychic complex. This great discovery is really the essence of shadow work. Now, but when we undertake to make ourselves aware, so if we become conscious of this thing, right? We're driven, we do step one, and then there's something that happens to us. We sort of decide to turn our will and our lives over to something else because we're just not sure who's actually running the show, right? We're just pretty sure it's not us all the time. So what we do then is we begin to engage in shadow work, right? And as we begin to become more and more self-aware. And what happens then is a new third entity sort of pops up, right? And this is an entity that Jung says that is by and large the alchemist called Mercurius. And this is going to be, I'm going to tie all this into our own experience. So don't get too stressed about this. Mercurius is a duplex character, meaning that it represents the opposing energies of the unconscious, the highest and the lowest, instinct versus spirit, good versus evil. All of those dualities that we examine in Shadow of a Figure of Light within the umbrella of the archetype of the alcoholic, Mercurius essentially fills the same role in alchemy. So Mercurius becomes the goal of the conjunctio oppositorum. Mercurius is the child of the sun and the moon. Which, those characters unite, they create a child. The child is called Mercurius. What I want to point out here is that, so we talk about the archetype of the alcoholic, and the archetype of the alcoholic is, for all intents and purposes, equated to Mercurius as well as the trickster. They're all sort of the same. They all symbolize the same thing. But I think I really like to introduce Mercurius into the conversation in this kind of within the context of alchemy, because it really adds a layer of nuance and flavor to the idea or the concept of the archetype of the alcoholic. So Mercurius is alchemy's chief figure. And I want to go back to the parallel systems of the church, right? The Catholic Church and alchemy in ancient times. They're running parallel. And as the church kind of gained ground, and as the ego gained ground, consciousness gains ground, the church fathers begin to formulate Christian dogma, and they kind of stamp out, they try to stamp out Gnosticism, right? So there's not a lot of Gnostic texts around. They were writing giant books and essays about different heretics and stuff like that. So this whole sort of conversation was taking place, and they were killing people and everything else. So Gnosticism is essentially forcefully stamped out, but the symbols themselves that the Gnostics were toying with, obviously they're not going to go anywhere. They just drift back into the unconscious, and they begin to emerge, right, within the dreams and fantasies of certain mystical people, alchemists. This is what Jung says. With the triumph of Christianity under Constantine, the old pagan ideas did not vanish, but lived on in the strange arcane terminology of philosophical alchemy. Its chief figure was Hermes or Mercurius, in his dual significance as Quicksilver and the world's soul, with his companion figures Sol, gold, and Luna, silver. The alchemical operation consisted essentially in separating the prima materia, the so-called chaos, into the active principle, the soul, and the passive principle, the body, which were then reunited in personified form in the conjunctio or the chemical marriage. So if we were to boil down this alchemical process. They essentially put stuff into their containers. They got it hot, they got it cold, they added water, they did this and that to it till eventually there's like a steam that separates, right? And that was that active principle. That's the male principle, right? And then what's left there is the body, right? It's just like the ashes and stuff like that. So now they've created this separatio. Then what they would do was they would reunite these elements in the coniunctio. And so and then what emerges is this new thing, right? And that's what they called Mercurius. So they're using symbolic language to sort of describe this weird chemical process. Let's see. I'll just keep reading. In other words, the coniunctio is allegorized as the hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, the ritual cohabitation of Sol and Luna. From this union sprang the filius sapiente, or filius philosophorum, the transformed Mercurius, who was thought of as hermaphroditic in token of his rounded perfection. So the thing that emerges then is both male and female, right? And so with Jung, he was looking at this in terms of psychological transformation, and discovered that these feminine symbols sort of they're housed in the unconscious, while the masculine symbols are more kind of in consciousness, and that these in the process of analyzing a person, like a patient or whatever, these things are sort of separated and then they come back together. So really all of this is just a symbolical way of describing the process of psychological transformation. I want to say this too, that as alchemy's chief figure, Mercurius is the mirror image of Jesus Christ. So if Jesus he's the savior in the ecclesiastical realm, Mercurius is then the goal of the alchemical process, right? So the alchemists too would often equate Mercurius with the Christ figure in later on in later alchemy. So with that sort of basis, we're going to turn back to my own psychological drama, which is really just a condensed version of this big collective drama that we're looking at. So last week we left off with the emergence of Sophia, who is a variation of the anima, and that she sort of appeared to me in a couple poems, the latest one being God's Folly, right? So Sophia trapped in matter. Now this is, Jung says this in Mysterium Conjunctionis. He says, the anima is a feminine psychopomp who shows one the way to Mercurius and how to find the phoenix. So the phoenix is the firebird that also goes through a transformation, but and it's equated with Mercurius. But I find a lot of meaning in this particular phrase, because the way I understand this, so a psychopomp is Jung says is a mediator between the realms of light and dark, a messenger of the gods who appears when the soul is in flux. When the anima appeared to me, I was in flux, right? But what I've discovered is that when Sophia came in this poem, God's Folly, in 2019, from my own individuation, my own psychological growth, right? She had come to show me the way to the archetype of the alcoholic, or which is equated with Mercurius. So and what happens then, because after 2019 and I write this poem, I get more and more into Jung stuff, and then I engage in a very long and active, sorry about that. I begin to engage in a very long, active imagination. And what emerges in that is the archetype of the alcoholic, right? So, and what I find interesting about this is that as the archetype of the alcoholic emerged, if I look at my own psychological process, I was seeing a therapist once a week. I was talking to my sponsor. We were meeting, talking about therapy, just like I was really doing a lot of heavy lifting, like in the soul, right? And as I'm doing that, this image of the archetype of the alcoholic begins to emerge, which is an image of wholeness. So, and I'm going to read this. This is a quote actually in Shadow of a Figure of Light. And let's see. So, and sorry about that. It's blocking my view. The phantom of the trickster, this is Jung in his essay on the psychology of a trickster figure. It says, the phantom of the trickster haunts the mythology of all ages, sometimes in quite unmistakable form, sometimes in strangely modulated guise. A curious combination of typical trickster motifs can be found in the alchemical figure of Mercurius. For instance, his fondness for sly jokes and malicious pranks, his powers as a shapeshifter, his dual nature, half animal, half divine, his exposure to all kinds of tortures, and last but not least, his approximation of the figure of a savior. These qualities make Mercurius seem like a demonic being resurrected from primitive times. So, in other words, the trick we saw in Shadow of the Figure of Light, that the trickster and the alcoholic are essentially the same, like one and the same. The alcoholic appears in all different costumes, or the trickster appears in all different costumes. Well, one of those costumes is the alcoholic. The other one, or another one, is Mercurius. And so what this means for us then, in terms of this thing we're trying to discover, right? Jung says it's sort of this elusive, arcane, weird thing that we're trying to, pull out of the ether, this symbolized by Mercurius, is that we already have our fingers on that thing just by way of our experience of and understanding of the archetype of the alcoholic. So because they're both duplex characters, they both represent a fusion of the opposites. They both represent the archaic nature of the human psyche, as well as the highest spiritual, goals and attainments that we can have. That means that the archetype of the alcoholic is a modern variation of Mercurius. And I'm not going to get into the archetype of the alcoholic here. So if you're new and you're interested, there's videos on my website, my YouTube page. Chapter 11 in my book discusses the archetype of the alcoholic. There's 2 videos on that. There's also there's a section called the archetype of the alcoholic seminars, because I've given multiple talks about this. And they're posted on Friendly Circle Berlin as well. So, but essentially, the archetype of the alcoholic is Mercurius, and that I really, I'm just gonna and this is what's wild. You won't find a single statement from Jung or any alchemist about Mercurius that doesn't also apply to the archetype of the alcoholic. From a symbolical, sort of psychological perspective, they're one and the same. So with that, then we have this sort of foundation, right, for understanding that the anima is a psychopomp who shows one the way to Mercurius, right? And so then in my own growth, sort of the Mercurius emerges as the archetype of the alcoholic. Now we're going to get into some dreams and some fairy tales that deal with Mercurius a little more clearly. So this is from a Grimm fairy tale. It's called The Spirit in a Bottle. And I'm just going to read this. It says, once upon a time, there was a poor woodcutter. He had only one son whom he wished to send to a high school. However, since he could only give him a little money to take with him, it was used up long before the time for the examinations. So the son went home and helped his father with the work in the forest. Once during the midday rest, he roamed the woods and came to an immense old oak. There he heard a voice calling from the ground, "Let me out, let me out." He dug down among the roots of the tree and found a well-sealed glass bottle from which, clearly, the voice had come. He opened it, and instantly a spirit rushed out and soon became half as high as the tree. The spirit cried in an awful voice, "I have had my punishment, and I will be revenged. I am the great and mighty spirit Mercurius, and now you shall have your reward. Whoso releases me, him I must strangle." This made the boy uneasy, and quickly thinking up a trick, he said, "First, I must be sure that you are the same spirit that was shut up in that little bottle." To prove this, the spirit crept back into the bottle. Then the boy made haste to seal it, and the spirit was caught again. But now the spirit promised to reward him richly if the boy would let him out. So he let him out and received as a reward a small piece of rag. Quoth the spirit, "If you spread one end of this over a wound, it will heal, and if you rub steel or iron with the other end, it will turn into silver." Thereupon the boy rubbed his damaged axe with the rag, and the axe turned to silver, and he was able to sell it for 400 thaler. Thus, father and son were freed from all worries. The young man could return to his studies, and later, thanks to his rag, he became a famous doctor. And so what happens here is that, and this is just, it's just another variation of this myth that we're talking about that we find in the 12 steps, we find in the archetype of the alcoholic, the trickster. It just repeats over and over and over with different symbols. It's the same myth that's sort of repeating in our dreams. But Mercurius essentially comes and sort of gives this kid, this poor boy, gives him the art of alchemy, right? Which allows him to both heal people as well as to turn base metals into gold or silver. And there's so much kind of, there's so much symbolism in that story in terms of just getting sober, right? We believe that the bottle is only a symbol, right? But that within the bottle, there's great power, right? Not only for spiritual wealth, but for many people, there's access to material wealth as well, right? And this is a common story in the 12 steps. And so there's a lot of parallels here, right? With Mercurius and the archetype of the alcoholic and the trickster. I really like this quote from Jung. So if you read Shadow of a Figure of Light, you've been with us, you know that that the archetype of the alcoholic is based on this character that Wilson developed called the anonymous alcoholic. That was sort of a way I sort of depicted the 12-step myth, right? That central to that myth is this character of the anonymous alcoholic. And the archetype of the alcoholic serves this purpose as the trickster, right? That it tricks the ego into relinquishing its delusion of control. Mercurius is also, in the same way, it's sort of this tricky component, right? That sort of wakes the ego up, and it sort of brings the ego into this magic realm. But this is what I really like. This Jung's giving commentary on the spirit in the bottle fairy tale. And this is what he says: the encounter of the poor student with the spirit in the bottle portrays the spiritual adventure of a blind and unawakened human being. And I just think that that's one of the best descriptions of the alcoholic dilemma that I've ever heard. I feel like, for me personally, that my fixation and sort of dedication to spirits it's not a counterfeit. We hear that so often, that it's sort of a counterfeit spirituality. I don't know if it's counterfeit, because it felt so real. And I have to trust my soul and my gut when it comes to these things. I feel like I have a pretty good radar about what's real and what's not real. And that was real. But what it was the spiritual adventure of a blind and unawakened human being, right? But that served a purpose to lead me towards awakening. So it's all part of the same process, right? And thank God Wilson included step 1 in the 12 steps, because I think from a purely sort of mythological perspective, without step 1, the 12 steps don't have the same power. They lack that dark prima materia, right? What Jung called the negretto, or the alchemists called it that darkness, that blackness out of which the process unfolds. That's a key component of transformation. Now, we saw earlier that Mercurius is a duplex. That means that it has a dual nature. And I just want to quickly read this, just to sort of recap that we talk about this duplex. We can sort of formulate these things in these pictorial kind of ways to understand. So as the alcoholic undergoes this transformation, right, from a drinking alcoholic to a sober alcoholic, the shaman that used to be the trickster, right? So the archetype of the shaman and the archetype of the trickster, those two are combined, right? And in the background of the psyche, the trickster longs to be reborn and to become the shaman. Same thing with Mercurius. There's an original Mercurius who's sort of the troublemaker, but there's also the new Mercurius who's the born again Mercurius. And I'm going to read this quote from Edinger. He says, "You must always remember that Mercurius is the personification of the autonomous unconscious. The original Mercurius is the unconscious in its original unconscious state. Mercurius as the lapis is the unconscious when the ego has related to it consciously. So that's that's the transformation, right? The improved, when conscious contact has been improved, the ego relates consciously. Out of the original Mercurius, Sol and Luna emerge as a pair of opposites. When these opposites are again united, they give birth to a child, the Filius, which is equivalent to the Lapis. Now, so this is what happens for me in my own growth, right? Is that what emerged out of the archetype of the alcoholic, right? And just the process in general is the opposites. They're symbolized as to drink or not to drink, but once you see the opposites anywhere, you see them everywhere. And so symbolically then Sol and Luna emerge. And then what Edinger says here is that when they're reunited, then they give birth to a new child. This is the alchemical thing called Mercurius. So now I'm going to jump into one of my dreams. Okay. And from here on out, we're just going to be going pretty heavy into dream analysis. And so dreams and symbols, right? So we've laid the groundwork, and now here we're finally going to set out. Now recall, Edinger says, out of the original Mercurius, Sol and Luna emerge as a pair of opposites. When these opposites are again united, they give birth to the son, the Filius, which is the equivalent to the Lapis. So that is the thesis statement then for everything that basically takes place. I'm going to just set up the time frame, and then we're going to roll. So the book was finished in August of 2024. I basically turned it over to the publisher. I couldn't do anything else with it. I started writing down my dreams every day. I started reading alchemy books and dream symbolism books. I was reading Jung's Mysterium Connectionis, so really just trying to understand this stuff as best I can. And in October of 2024, I have this dream. This is the dream. The moon is setting in the most remarkable way, reminiscent of a beautiful sunset. Only the sky is pitch black, and the moon is a giant pumpkin that has been carved out like a jack-o'-lantern, a warm glow gently lighting the world from within. So when this dream originally occurred, I wrote it down, and I even told Ming about it, but it just didn't mean much. I just thought it was funny. I thought, oh, the unconscious has an interesting sense of humor to give me this dream right around Halloween. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, that's funny. I had another dream shortly thereafter about pumpkins. And this dream was that I was in a city, and a big flood had come through the city and deposited like millions of dried pumpkins, right? So they were white, and they were just everywhere in the city. And the goal was that we were going to put all the pumpkins on a big barge and then take them out in the middle of the ocean and just dump them. So when I had that next dream about pumpkins, I started to do some research, and I started to try to figure out what the pumpkins mean. And I have a pretty good idea now of what both of these dreams mean. And this was kind of one of my first forays of like, I was like, okay, I need to study this. What is the symbolism of the pumpkin? And what I was led to was a gourd, right? So the gourd is a dried out little pumpkin and in my own sort of connection to that is that ancient, tribesmen would use those gourds to carry water, right? So the water of life and stuff like that. So, but certainly a spiritual significance, a container, right? Of vase. Now, a few weeks later, so, early November, right after Halloween, I had this dream. I'm going to read it. I'm at a family reunion. The owner of the house has a huge, muscular black pit bull and an equally large, powerful, and intimidating mountain lion as pets. When I sit down in a chair in the living room, the dog follows me and sits next to me. I pet the dog on its head. The lion comes near us. Then the dog growls at the lion, and the lion hisses back. It's apparent that they are about to fight, so I move to another chair across the room. The dog follows me, and as I pet the dog again, the situation with the lion is repeated, more growling and hissing. I move again, and when the owner finally lets the two animals get into it, they fight briefly, But the lion quickly becomes docile and lies on its side in the center of the room. With its head flat on the carpeted floor, front and rear legs stretched out perfectly straight, the giant cat lies there utterly submissive. Then the dog nudges the lion with its snout, hops around it a few times, dominating over it, and then starts humping it like a puppy. Suddenly, the lion morphs into a man standing next to me, a newcomer in AA, whom I congratulate for bringing the key element of willingness. I woke up to the well-known phrase from the book Alcoholics Anonymous in my mind: willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but of these, willingness is indispensable. Now, again, when these dreams are coming, I have no idea what they mean. What I've learned later is that this dream is an amplification. That's the word that Jung would use, amplification of the previous dream about the moon as a glowing pumpkin. So I have this dream and I'm like, this is really significant, but I still have no idea what it means. So what I do is I start digging, and I happen to be reading Jung's Mysterium Connjunctionis at the same time. So there's all this synchronicity happening. So what I'm going to do is try to unveil to you guys how I was able to sort of, create meaning within the context of these images. So in Mysterium, basically what Jung does is he kind of packs in just like thousands of citations from different alchemical texts to sort of like, it's like an anatomy book. The anatomy of the psyche is that difficult to read. It's full of just random stuff that just doesn't make any sense, but it has these little snippets in it here and there. And when you'll notice one and you'll be like, oh wait, that sort of rings to me. So, the first thing that became apparent was that dogs and lions are highly significant spiritual symbols, which it was surprising to me to learn that dogs are so significant, but they are. And when the dogs and the lions interact, this is very indicative of something important happening in the psychic background, right? And so I'm going to sort of parse this out as it came to me. So the first thing that struck me was this sentence: the puppy will guard you in your house from the beginning, in this world and in the next. So this is a quote from an alchemical text that Jung was giving. And it kind of landed on me because I was like, wow, that's exactly what happened in my dream. The dog was guarding me in the house, right? Which is a symbol of the vas hermeticum. So the owner of the house, right? The owner of the dog and the lion and the owner of the house, that's a symbol of the self, right? The sort of overarching, right? This thing. Now, and then the me in the dream, right? This person who's going from chair to chair to try to avoid the fight, that's the ego. And then we're going to see that the lion and the dog each have highly significant roles in my psyche as well. So the next phrase, I guess, or another phrase that really caught me out of Mysterium Connjunctionis was this one. Jung quotes, "May Diana, the goddess of the moon, be propitious to thee who knoweth how to tame wild beasts." And so again, this is clearly what had happened in my dream, right? The puppy came to guard me in the house and then was taming the wild beast. But then luckily I looked up the word Diana because I didn't really know who she was. And it just so happens that Diana is the goddess of the moon. And so now I began to sort of piece together that these two dreams are connected in some way. It also struck me that dogs are equated with moon symbolism, right? And this would be a good Chat GPT or DeepSeek exercise. What is dog symbolism in alchemy or something like that? And I did that this morning. There was a whole bunch that comes up, right? But it just sort of dawned on me. I was like, oh, I think dogs are often represented with the moon. For example, coyotes are always howling at the moon, right? So then what's happened here then is that the moon, the Luna that was carved into a jack-o'-lantern, has now appeared then as this helpful dog. So we've gone from Thalia to Sophia to Luna to Diana, right? So there's we see the anima morphing, right? And it says she may become propitious, right? So she starts out as being like even less than helpful and then becomes helpful as she transforms. And so she's appeared as a black dog. She's come to tame the lion, who is the wild beast, right? And I want to say this. So now the symbolism of the lion is equated with sun symbolism. Okay. That the sun, the lion, the sun, the king, these are all reflections of the conscious dominant, right? So they could be reflections of the church, they could be reflections of the civilization, they could be reflections of the 12-step community, whatever the kind of herd think is, or whatever the thing is that I have to individuate from, right? That's the conscious dominance. So that's what the lion symbolizes in this dream. The next clue that it came because she's black, right? She has a black coat. And this is a major theme as well in terms of the symbolism of the goddess, right? This blackness becomes a symbol of the cosmos, the unconscious, the Negretto stage of the alchemical opus, the prima materia, right? Jung says this of the Shulamite in Song of Solomon's, for anyone who reads the Old Testament. This is another variation of this same goddess archetype and this same mythological motif that just repeats over and over and over. This is what it says. By the sin of Eve, she is plunged, as it were, in ink in the tincture and blackened to the point that she will remain forever dark. This blackness is more than a veneer, for it will not wash off and is merely compensated by her inward beauty. And the bridegroom who comes is Mercurius, the son and the lover, who loves her in spite of her blackness. And so Jung then is what he's doing in Mysterium Connectionis is he essentially goes through like 6 or 7 different renditions of this same exact myth, right? So you can tell it in terms of the king and the queen, which I'm going to probably do some of that next week. Also the sun and the moon. Also, and just so, and then different variations on each of those, right? So this is just one version of this story, but and we're going to see like this repeats in the New Testament, like it's the same thing repeated over and over and over. Now, when you're trying to, this is the key, I think, for trying to really get into our dreams and figure out what they mean is like, what are these little details, right? Like the blackness of the dog's coat becomes a really important detail. The moon connection is very important, right? And I think that we can, when we're trying to interpret our dreams, we can really we can go into these books and we can go into this stuff really trusting that the unconscious wants to make itself conscious through us. And so when we get a little hint or a clue, it's good to just kind of like fixate on that and be like, okay, what is this? What does this mean? And to write it down and to journal it, because this is how these meanings come. So basically, when I'm figuring all this out, a narrative begins to form. Okay. And I have a couple paragraphs that I've written, and essentially, and I'm actually going to get this published in the Jung Journal this spring. So, but reading these texts allows me to build this narrative, and to recognize that the dog is a symbol of the moon and the sun is a symbol of the lion, right? Those are equated here, the mountain lion in my dream, and that it starts to make sense because in the dream of the dog and the lion, the black dog dominates over the lion, right? And then the lion morphs into a newcomer in AA. So this is what I've written. Typically, the color of her coat, or Luna's coat, a shining robe of the deepest black, would indicate the blackness of the new moon, when the brilliant whiteness of the full moon is hidden from our view on Earth. However, in the dream, Luna dominates over the lion, a symbol for the sun, suggesting that this is more than just the new moon. It is the blackness of the eclipse when the sun is darkened. And then this is a quote that Jung gives us in Mysterium. He says, the lion is the lower sun and is eclipsed, for the moon is the shadow of the sun. And through her corruption is the lion eclipsed with the help of Mercurius. Yet his eclipse is changed to usefulness and to a better nature, and one more perfect than the first. So The corruption of the moon, along with the moisture of Mercurius, which I really like that phrasing, is that the Mercurius essentially helps the moon to eclipse the sun, right? So in terms of psychological growth, this represents the process whereby the conscious dominant is either overpowered by the unconscious, which would be seen in like a dream of a giant wave coming over, right? Or perhaps a more voluntary sort of domination of the unconscious, or like a voluntary entrance, right? That the conscious, that the ego like voluntarily enters into the unconscious. So in the dream of the Luna as jack-o'-lantern, it's significant that the pale white light of the moon has been replaced by a glowing red radiance. And the reason that's interesting is because, so we talked about the albedo earlier, the whitening, right? That hyper spirituality that we get when we're new in recovery, right? But that whitening, that sort of process needs to have some blood given to it. It's got to become more real. And that's what's symbolized by the rubido, or the reddening. In ancient times, the white light of the moon was actually considered harmful. So like, you know, like not just alchemists, but like everybody, like women wouldn't let their little kids go out in a full moon because the white light of the moon had dangerous characteristics. And so there's something happening here, that the light that's emanating from inside of the pumpkin has been changed to this red glowing radiance, or this, what Jung says here, to usefulness in a better nature. And so now we talk about Mercurius as he's often sort of depicted as the facilitator of this cohabitation, right? If he's not just blatantly involved in it. And we're going to look at more examples of this next week. But I want to say that when I had the dream of the pumpkin, the glowing, you know, the moon as a pumpkin, the Luna as jack-o'-lantern, that it occurred to me like that the unconscious is kind of funny, like that's funny. And then it dawned on me later, oh, that was the trickster, right? Like who else would change the moon into a jack-o'-lantern right before Halloween? So there's the presence of the trickster, or Mercurius, kind of sort of permeating through all this. And so what happens is that these archetypes are sort of working in the background. They're in order to help facilitate their each of their own transformations, right? Because the trickster wants to become the shaman, the anima too wants to become helpful, right? And then the king, the conscious dominant, the sun, needs to become more useful, right? So that it's not just scorching everything. And so the psyche, all the components of the psyche are working together for sort of a mutual psychological change, right? And that is the emergence of the self, where all of these components are in balance, right? And then the self is at the center. This is the next paragraph from my essay, Taming Wild Beasts. Evidence of Mercurius appeared in the previous dream when he changed the moon into a jack-o'-lantern. Now, with his help and through corruption, her own dark nature, Luna eclipses soul, the meaning of which is revealed through the sequence of events as they unfold in the dream. Initially, the dog dominates over the lion, but this playful nudging quickly turns into humping, a conjunctio in which soul is embraced by the new moon. This union results in the birth of the child, the filius Mercurius, symbol of a more fully integrated psyche. So, in the dream where the dog, the anima humps the lion, right? So that's the anima humping the logos. What emerges from that strange interaction is the newcomer in AA, right? So which is equivalent to Mercurius. So then what takes place here is that the dreams are sort of running kind of parallel to each other. And there's other dreams that I'm going to talk about next week that even kind of shed more light on this. Basically, I also want to say this too, in terms of my sort of formulation of the archetype of the alcoholic, whatever, and then especially my equating that archetype to the figure of Mercurius. I presented this dream in this essay that I'm putting in the journal as sort of maybe some proof, at least, so maybe a little bit of proof of this correlation between the archetype of the alcoholic and Mercurius, because it seems pretty clear to me that the alcoholic in this dream is really is correlated very quite highly to Mercurius. Now the we're looking at the symbolism of the coniunctio, right? And a few weeks ago, we read that the Gnostic myth of Sophia, we saw Jung say that she is the feminine principle trapped in matter who longs to be penetrated by the nous. And those were the words that Jung used. Psychologically, that means that the unconscious is beckoning the ego to take note of it. The word numinous itself comes from the Latin word, which means to nod or to beckon. So what we have here is that a variation of the myth that we explored in Shadow of the Figure of Light, of the longing of the unconscious to become conscious, right? We've said this in many different ways. It's for God to become human, right? The transformation of the God image. Step 11, right? We sought to improve our conscious contact with God. Inasmuch as God is a reflection of what we are yet to be conscious of, I think it's safe to say that that is also a depiction of this very ancient motif. This is what Jung says, expanding on it, dragging in the images of Gnosticism. Here again, we have a repetition of the coniunctio of Father Nous and Mother Physis. So long as consciousness refrains from acting, the opposites will remain dormant in the unconscious. Once they have been activated, the regis filius, spirit, logos, nous, those are all masculine symbols, is that the nous is activated, is swallowed up by physis, the feminine. That is to say, the body and the psychic representatives of the organs gain mastery over the conscious mind. In the hero myth, this state is known as being swallowed up in the belly of the whale or dragon. The heat there is usually so intense that the hero loses his hair, i.e. is reborn bald as a babe. This heat is the ignis genalius, the hell into which Christ descended in order to conquer death as part of his opus. So, for example, then we have more dream images, right? So very often people would dream of losing some hair. I actually had a dream right around this time of like pulling hair out, and the hair was like, it had like bulbs on the end as if I was pulling it out of like rich soil, and the hair was growing like an onion sprout or like a weed. So that's the same thing that's taking place here, right? It's all combined because the consciousness is sort of embedded by the unconscious, or embedded within it. So and also here I want to call back some attention to what Jung says here about the body, right? And this, if you were, so when we speak of the mystery of compulsion, and especially like in later sobriety, it really begs the question. So, and there's a great way of talking about this with one of von Franz's examples. She talks about there was a masturbating monk who had come to see her to be analyzed because he had a problem with masturbating. He had taken vows. He wasn't supposed to do that. And then, and he's fantasizing about the real thing and all this. So it's just this big, impossible dilemma for the monk, right? And the thing about this is a very informative example for us, because for us sitting out here, most of us would hear that story, and then and we would be quite compassionate towards the monk. And if the monk was like, if he really needed to go experience the real thing and put down the cloth and like become a regular person with a wife and kids or whatever, we would all be like, hey, that's a good thing. Like, that's clearly like, you should do that. Like, there's no judgment, right? But what I just want to point out here, and I think what Jung is talking about here too, in terms of how the instinct comes up like this, we're trying to release the soul that's trapped in our bodies. And very often that is happening through these instinctual sort of, compulsions. And so we can be compassionate towards the monk and say, yeah, he probably needs to go live a different kind of life. But when those same sort of drives and compulsions are bombarding us from within, are we equally as compassionate towards ourselves, or do we just say, oh, no, don't think about that, that's horrible, that's bad, I shouldn't do that, right? And so I think that there's an invitation here in terms of trying to experience the rubido, right? To go from the whitening to the reddening, where that's where the real transformation happens, is to be compassionate to ourselves when we have these sort of instinctual drives, and to allow ourselves to recognize that perhaps God is trying to get our attention this way, and that there's something for us to look at. Now, it doesn't mean we have to go act on those instincts, right? Maybe not. So the von Franz would say that's up to each person to ask God themselves in that specific instance, what is God's will, right? So very often, see, what happens is all this symbolism comes into play because we have this conscious dominant over here that's telling us, no, that's wrong, that's bad, don't do that. And what it does is it produces this conflict of duty, right? And between what the body wants and what the soul needs versus what the spirit, or that masculine spirituality that we've been talking about, what it is thinks it's demanding and what it thinks is important. And so just food for thought and worth really kind of pondering as we go out from here. I have one more slide, and I wanted to show you this slide. Before I reveal this slide, I want to say why, is because a couple of weeks ago, a person in the group had a dream that, and when she had mentioned this dream, these images had popped into my mind, but I forgot where I'd found them. But then they came back to me as I was looking at Hermes Mercurius, right? So I'm gonna put those on the screen now, and I just want to say that we're right back in the sexual element of this whole process, right? Where it's pretty blatantly sexual. I mean, the dream of the dog humping the lion, right, is just one small example of the nature of what's going on here. So Mercurius is hermaphroditic. So he or she can be depicted as a male, as a female. Often the symbols contaminate, so it could be a male 1 minute and a female the next minute. It's really for the person to kind of wade through and try to figure out. Mercurius very often appears as both male and female, right? So for example, the dragon biting its own tail would be, that's a Mercurius symbol, right? Jung says that Mercurius is the dragon. And very often that dragon it's not actually eating its own tail, it's self-impregnating, right? That's an alchemical depiction of that symbol. So this just the nature of these things, it's just how they are. So I wanted to show this image because it reminds me of the dream of a woman, licking the testicles of the Buddha, which, come to think of it in terms of some of these images and stuff, could very well be an image of Mercurius, right? I don't know the individual psychology or anything, but it's not so far-fetched to think that the Buddha could or that Mercurius could appear as a Buddha. This is what Jung says. Mercurius has a phallic aspect in alchemy, being related to Hermes Iphiphallacus, or the just one, the organ of generation. Hermes is the spout of waters, or the tube, the fistula and water pipe, and the spring of bubbling water. Such comparisons mislead the modern mind into one-sided interpretations, for instance, that he is simply the penis, or conversely, that the obviously sexual language has no basis in real sexuality. But in mysticism, one must remember that no symbolic object has only one meaning. It is always several things at once. Sexuality does not exclude spirituality, nor spirituality sexuality, for in God all opposites are abolished. In alchemy, Mercurius is the ligament of the soul, uniting spirit and body. His dual nature enables him to play the role of mediator. He is bodily and spiritual, and is himself the union of these two principles. And so, yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think that in terms of the male component of Mercurius, this sort of iphiphalic Mercurius would be that aspect of of an ego that's transformed enough to actually descend into the unconscious. I think that might be a way to project some meaning into the male figure of Mercurius, right? And then I do actually have one more slide. And we've seen this before, and I'm not even going to read what it says here, but what I want to point out is very briefly, this is a whole depiction of this myth, because what's happening here is in the top half, they're on the throne, and you have the Trinity, right? There's God the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost in the form of a dove. And what's happening here is the coronation of the Virgin, right? So the God the Father is putting a crown on the Virgin. And that's a symbol of the unconscious becoming conscious. The crown is a representation of consciousness, just like the sun's rays are consciousness, or the lion's mane. Below the surface in alchemy, right, or in the dream world, as the unconscious becomes conscious, right, then a new entity, a new strange, being is born, right? And that's Mercurius being pulled out of the lump of matter. And these two things are happening simultaneously, right? And then so they really do depict this process of psychic change. This is just like I hope it's coming across that what I'm presenting here is really this hyper symbolic depiction of the process that we all engage in when we come into the rooms, when we take the 12 steps, when we go see a therapist, when we engage with others. I just this stuff has blown me open. The sex thing is very interesting to me. It's really changed my perspective of sex, and so yeah. Anyways, I'm going to turn it back over now, and I will stop sharing, and we'll go back to Patrick, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Yes, thank you, Duncan. And everybody can unmute if you wish and express your appreciation on what we've just.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So great.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
So helpful.
Thank you.
Very cool.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Cody.
So we have 47 people on the call right now, and we are open for questions and answers. You can raise your hand, and I'll call you up in the order that I see you. You can have questions, it's open. So if you have questions about what you've heard, or if you've had a dream recently that you'd like to share and discuss, that's all possible. And Dave is going to keep the time, so he's going to set the clock, I think, to one minute. So we would like you to keep to a certain amount of time, so that if more people want to engage, that will be possible. And the first hand that I see up is Diana. So how do I do this? Yes, please unmute and come in.
Hi, Diana. I'm so used to Amy saying Diana alcoholic. I have to keep this off because I'll lose everything. And I'm just, ever since I've been introduced to you, Cody, and you sharing this with the Berlin group. I mean, thank you to the Berlin group too for this fascinating series and what you give to us. I mean, I'm blown away. I've been in AA for a long time. And when I first heard of Carl Jung, I was just drawn to it, right? It's like, and I remember getting the Red Book out of the library, Carl Jung's Red Book, and it is so deep for me. But beyond my knowledge of understanding it, it resonated spiritually. So it's like years later, I come into this and it's like you're helping me to put things together. And I just mainly want to thank you. And also the series that you presented just now, I've had a problem with religion like so many of us, but what you've done is you've helped me to make a connection of like Mercurius and then the sun, being the sun or whatever. I was thinking to myself, yeah, there's a connection of what religion has done that's taken away from this interpretation of what Jung's giving, and you are presenting. And it's just, it's like, I'm just fascinated, Cody, is all I can say. And if you can open a door of fascination to a human being of their own discovery and their program of recovery, it's like, bravo to you. So mainly just to commend you and thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Diane. I really, really appreciate that. It is an honor to be able to present these things. You know, I mean, obviously, all credit to Jung. I mean, there's not a lot of original stuff here. But I agree. Like we're so lucky to have access to this really kind of next level stuff. It's mind blowing. So, and thank you for coming. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Diane. And the next up is Joel near Zurich.
Hey, hi everybody. Is my I got some new headphones. Hope the audio is okay. Great, thanks. So yeah, I've attended your series sort of in the background, Cody, because my home group meets on Tuesday nights. But I appreciate you putting them up on your website where I can listen to them, not always with the Q&A, but it's also rekindled my in a really white hot way. Last week I got to the library and checked out Edinger and Robert Johnson, and just I'm sort of what is the word, binging on everything young at the moment. But here's my question, and I'm sorry, it really doesn't have anything to do with your lecture today or your book. Recently, my wife was
Looks like Joel's frozen. Back
uh-oh.
again, Joel?
I'll put off my video. Maybe that will help. Is that better?
Yeah, you were at recently my wife.
Right. Was in conversation with a friend, and her friend has a twin sister who recently died. So in her 60s, relatively young. And we were talking about the collective unconscious, and she brought up Dolores Cannon, who was a famous hypnosis and was quite prolific in her writings of those hypnotic, I don't know, imagination. So I wondered if you could comment on what role, or if any, does very lucid hypnosis play in the collective unconscious, or in awakening other I don't know, other access to the to the unknown. Thank you. As you can tell, I also have a cold.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks for coming, and for participating. So I think that I haven't studied hypnosis per se, but there's so many different sort of, I think, avenues to be able to access the collective unconscious. One, von Franz talks a lot about telepathy, right? Which means that it's not necessarily communicating between 2 points, but it's that different things are understood at the same time in 2 different locations. So I think that, I think when it comes to really any sort of spiritual practice, if we want to call it spiritual, is that it kind of goes back to William James, in week 1 of shadow work, which is, this idea of radical empiricism, right? And that I get to create meaning in whatever I choose to have meaning in. And so, which really opens the door to so many different avenues. Parapsychology is interesting. I think Wilson went to a parapsychology conference with his buddy, I can't think of his name right now. And Jung was into parapsychology. And just sort of the phenomenon of it, I've had an interesting encounter with a Ouija board once when I was a kid, which looking back at it now is quite revealing about even just sort of a comment on like where I'm at today. That we asked the thing what its name was, and it said red. Its name was red. And you'll see next week, if you're here, I have a dream that's like really telling about that experience, right? the other thing that happened with the Ouija board is that I think we asked it if God exists or something, and it started to go around in a circle. And two of us were holding on to it, and it just started going so fast that there was no way we were doing that consciously, right? And then it flew off the board. And that itself, right, is such a deep spiritual symbol. In my dream, where I'm in the room with the dog and the lion, I sort of circumambulate this room, right? From going from corner to corner, sort of drawing a circle, right? So, and I think the closer we get to the center, the more, the more that God is a circle whose circumference is everywhere and nowhere, says Jung, something like that. So all of this stuff really plays in, and I think that there's meaning to be found in really any sort of practice. So I think that's a very interesting question, and I thank you for it.
Thank you. Next up is Rob in Toronto. Would you please unmute and come in?
Thanks very much, Patrick. And hi, Cody. Great to see you as always, sir. Cody, you showed a picture, the first picture you showed of Mercurius. I would love if you could just show that picture one more time and explain the symbolism about what he's standing on, because a lot of times it's really important of what they're standing on. It has a lot of meaning. And so it was one of the first pictures way back, so I do apologize.
No, yeah, no problem. Let's see here. So is it this one?
No, it was actually, it said Mercurius, so it was back
okay.
further. And he was standing on two look like, there we go, right there.
Yeah. So, I don't know exactly what he's standing on, but they look like containers of some sort. Oh, they're fountains. So, so there's they're each fountains. They're sort of spilling out the water of life. And I think it's interesting that one of them's dark and one of them's light. I mean, that's, obvious, like a sort of a conjunction of opposites, right? One can be the moon, one can be the sun. I think that in terms of the water of life that's spilling out of these fountains, I mean, this reminds me of Patrick's dream, right? That the container with the water in it, that both that, that we need nourishment from both kind of equally. It's equally important to get nourishment from both. This is an interesting image too. So this is Mercurius. It looks to me like she's in a feminine aspect. However, it's possible that she's both male and female. I can't tell if she has one breast and like one pectoral muscle. That's possible. If that is the case, then there would be sort of a shift there, because the breast is on the side of the white fountain. And that would be interesting, because typically the breast would probably be on the side of the dark fountain, or I guess that's the yang principle. So she is crowned, that's with a star above her. So that could be probably a depiction of the star, the planet Mercury. I don't know what the Latin says, but, and then, there's the wings. And it is interesting too, that she's this, Mercurius is standing on these two containers that each have wings, and that the wings aren't on her. I do find that pretty interesting as well. That they're on the ground. They're not flying, they're sitting on the ground on top of like a mountain or something. Which I think is also an interesting symbol, because like, I know for me, I often dream about either climbing something or falling down. And depending on who we are, psychologically, like Jung has his types, his typology. And this also goes along with astrology as well. And so if we are like, I'm a thinking intuitive type, which means which means that for me, I'm always sort of have my head in the clouds, right? And so this is an interesting symbol. Like if I was to dream a symbol like this, then I would think, oh, this is a good omen because the wings are on the ground, right? Which is where I need to be. I need to be grounded. That's where the work that the work that the grounding work will be the most beneficial and nourishing for a person like me, because I'm by nature the kind of person who wants to be in the clouds all the time, right? And so, it's interesting. It would be very interesting if we knew who drew this and sort of more about them personally, because, I mean, like, for example, I mean, if a person who's more of a feeling sensation type had an image like this, then you might question, like, well, why are they still on the ground and spilling their water all over the ground? Those wings aren't working. They need to do something, like get off the ground. So it could kind of go both ways.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Cody.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
So thank you. So I put my hand up next and I have a dream. And I've got an app on my phone, and so when I wake up, I pick up the phone and I speak the dream onto the telephone, and then it has a transcripting facility, and that makes it all very much more user friendly. So I'm driving along a country road in flat countryside. I'm going pretty fast and I hear a siren, and I look back in the mirror and I see that there's some car with a flashing light up behind coming up at speed, and I want to pull into the side, but I see it's not possible to pull into the side because the road is a lot higher than the surrounding countryside. So I'm forced to stay on the road. And then I look ahead and I see a motorbike, and there's a pillion passenger on the motorbike, and it's a woman with long hair, and she turns around and she's got a rifle and she starts shooting at me. So a little later up the road, it's possible to turn off the road, and I'm in a village, and I stop up, and there seems to be a breakfast going on. And the food for the breakfast is all of this ultra processed food. It's this kind of plastic food that I would never eat myself. And I find it very amusing that I'm, among these people eating this food. And the talk is about some criminal, a sexual abuser. And the question that's being discussed is, what is the role of gender in his or her crimes? And then I meet a carpenter, and it looks like this carpenter and myself are going to do some pro bono work together, building something on a charity project. And it takes a while for me to realize, I thought it was a man initially, but now it's a woman. And then I'm waiting around. We're waiting around for a few days. We're trying to coordinate people over several time zones so that we get the lumber all organized. And the dream ends with me looking forward and expressing my readiness and willingness to get going as soon as the delivery of the lumber has been made. And that's the end of the dream.
It's very interesting. I mean, there's, as always, like there can be, I mean, it's why it's really important for us to dig out the meaning for ourselves. I mean, the things that stand out to me are the woman with the rifle, obviously, but then I think maybe she, who knows, like, is she a trickster? Is she, I mean, is she just trying to get your attention, or is she actually trying to murder you? Was she really shooting at you? Maybe she was shooting at the cop, like, I don't know. These are questions to ask, right? And, I think building something with this woman with lumber is an interesting symbol in terms of trying to build a spiritual structure. Groups of people are always really interesting in dreams. I always dream in like the plural, and it's weird because like sometimes I'll dream and it's like Ming and I, but then often it's not really Ming, or I guess I'm alone, but I always feel like there's many of us are there. And I think police, but those characters for me seem to be representative of the sort of the different entities in my own psyche. Whereas that's like in contrast to the other people, right? Which I think the other people very often would be reflective of the collective thinking, which I think the police also are that. So when I dream about police, I usually imagine that they are representative of the conscious dominant. That they're almost like in ancient times, they would be like the court jesters, right? Like the not the jesters, but the court, like the people in the court that would tell the king everything he wants to hear. They sort of represent that aspect of it. This sort of, but they're given authority to sort of like make you follow the rules. And so I think it's interesting that you didn't stop, that you kept going. You couldn't get off the road. There was no choice. So that the self is like moving you along. The dominant is concerned. The anima comes along and fires shots, which, death is not always a bad thing in dreams, right? I have a dream about death that I'll talk about next week. So, and I think initially we have those and we're like, oh no, like something's wrong, I died. But also in terms of spiritual progress, like death is always a good thing. So those are kind of my initial thoughts about it. I mean, that's a good dream. You've got some bangers, Patrick. Are those both this dream and the one from last week? Are those current? Like those are occurring to you now?
Yeah, these are the dreams that are coming up now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And while you were talking, it kind of, my hunch was that the lady on the motorbike who was shooting at me was the same lady that I ended up doing this project with.
Yeah.
So
it's so interesting. And who is also a lady and a man, like a kind of dualistic. So is that Mercurius,
Yeah.
And her shooting at you is sort of that tricks. To me, it's like a trickster element in a way, especially with the police chasing you. So I don't know. So much to think about.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next hand I see is Despina. Are you gone? Okay. So Donald, you're next. Please come in and unmute. You see the message to unmute, Donald?
Yeah, I got you now. This is not really good. Hello. This is everybody. This is not really a dream, but something I've been curious on Jung lately or for a while. I've been very interested in the paradox for but since my early sobriety. And I've been doing some studies with Rama Maharshi. And of course, it seems to be that paradoxically, Maharshi views the Jung's collective unconscious as more the collective conscious, and Jung had the unconscious. And I saw a story once where Jung went to India. He was intended to visit Maharshi and then didn't do it. And I wondered if he had ever dealt with the paradox of the unconscious and the conscious being the same, the two different views of it. That's about it.
Thanks, Donald. I really appreciate this question because I think it really is helpful because the idea of the ego also gets kind of tangled up in this conversation. But yes, like, so for example, like even Eckhart Tolle will use the word consciousness in the same way that I think the Jung and like, myself are just that that's the unconscious, right? And that the ego is sort of, what Jung calls consciousness. Like the ego is the vehicle of consciousness, whereas I think for them, very often they would say that the ego is like it to they view the ego more the way Jung might view the shadow. So something to be kind of shunned and tried to like, put away with. So, I think it's I think it's an important distinction if people are exploring Eastern forms of thought, is to really understand the terms from a pretty technical perspective, because otherwise I think it's pretty easy to get lost in the sauce and not really understand either system, because we're trying to look at it from as if they're equal, and they're not equal. They're absolutely different. So, and I'll say this too, like Jung, so like for a person like me, Jung, I'm pretty sure would prescribe me not to meditate, because I'm a thinking type and I'm an intuitive type. And so for me, if I'm doing exercises, because their goal in the East is to increase this thing called consciousness, right? So they're sort of exercising the muscle of like of a more focused kind of conscious attention. That's the goal, right? Is to focus on not thinking, and like so you're really working the ego is kind of working overtime. It's like flexing its muscles in a way. Whereas in Jung's system, and that may be a very good, so for somebody who's sort of drowning in the unconscious, Jung would say that is a good exercise for them to do, because they need to kind of get back to the right? Jung says the ego is here and now. So they need to exercise that here and now muscle. On the flip side though, for a person like me, I need to do less conscious stuff, less here and now, less floating around, and more kind of just allowing almost just allowing the thing to just kind of run its course, and to fantasize, and to do active imagination. That's the medicine for a thinking type like me. So, so I think it's important. These systems can all work, but we want to make sure we're taking the right medicine. And thanks, Donald. I really appreciate that perspective and that question. It's very insightful.
Okay, Cody, just a housekeeping question. How are we doing for time?
So we're good. I'm good for probably about 10 more minutes if you guys want to keep going.
Okay, so I got Despina and I've got Wesley. Let me see. Despina, are you dropping off and on again? Oh. Do any of you guys see Despina? Let's see. Despina. All right, so let's go to Wesley. And please come in, Wesley. So Wesley, have you seen my note? Please unmute. Yeah.
You're on
We
mute.
can't hear
Yeah,
you.
I'm
Wesley.
really, yeah,
good.
I was really struggling to unmute. Yeah, thank you so much, service team, and thank you so much, Cody, for your presentation. My name is Wesley, and I have a question. Okay, I know that I am such a dreamer because I really dream a lot, and I get to write them on my, on my journal. But there's this one dream that really stands out for me. I dreamt that I was around this woman. So this woman is actually a pastor here in Kenya, and the husband, died. So I saw myself sitting around them, and this woman, she was having her daughter. She was with her daughter, and they were dining somewhere. So I found myself with them, and then in real life, this lady has a newborn daughter. And so she handed the daughter to me, and I saw myself carrying her all through. But when I was trying to look at the face of this newborn daughter of hers, I couldn't quite, quite see her face clearly, I couldn't quite see her clearly, but I was holding her until I woke up. So I've been trying to find the interpretation of this dream. Please, could you help me to interpret? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for sharing that. And obviously, so if I were to have such a dream, I would suggest that, so typically like a person I find, so I dreamed the other night that I was in a classroom with, and I was on the front row taking notes, and Bob Bizance was the presenter. And I don't really know Bob or anything, but I thought, he probably would be a reflection of the self for me, just because of he's a man, he's older, and he's also like a person that I sort of hold in my own mind as a spiritual leader. So probably reflective of the self. So the pastor could be that for you. I think the dreams of little children are interesting in this case too. If the self in your dream gives you a child, that's highly significant of like this birth of the Mercurius function, right? That is Mercurius. So it would be really interesting to put this dream within the context of other dreams, whether there's been a conjunction, right? Whether the sun and the moon have like, created a kid or not, or a child. So that's another thing. In terms of holding the child, but not being able to see the face, I think that if I were to dream this, I would take this as a pretty clear signal, actually, that there's been progress, there's been a birth, there's that something is brewing, and that, but I'm still missing a key aspect of it. And so, and whatever that means, it just, I guess I would only just, which is like every dream, but it's just like, there's just more work to be done to clarify the symbol, to clarify the process, like to clarify something about your own reflection and what you're seeing about yourself. Like, is there something you're not looking at? Maybe that could be, a way to interpret it. I had an interesting dream about a child once, and when I picked the child had like, so first it did a bunch of flips across the bed, and then it fell off the bed and smacked its head on the wall. And I ran over and picked it up, and so it was this most beautiful little baby. And it had these big blue eyes, but it had a camera as its third eye. So like an iPhone camera right where the third eye would be. And it took it, and I'm still trying to figure out what the camera represents, right? Because the camera for me is always a recurring theme. I dream about cameras all the time. And and I'm not exactly sure what the camera represents yet, but I am pretty sure that in my case, when the child came like that, that was sort of that child was the self. And that this was this was a good omen for me. I felt like I was like, wow, like I'm doing some work, and something has been produced here. So and I say that too because of the feeling that I had when I was holding the baby. Like it was a very moving, like kind of feeling. So thank you for sharing that, Despina. I really love it.
Thank you. And Ming, would you like to take us out today with the last question?
Sure. There was actually a question in the chat that said, what is the lapis again? It was during Cody's presentation. I had responded, the Philosopher's Stone. Great question to ask Cody to elaborate on or remind us of.
So, and I'm just apologizing to Wesley for calling her Despina. So, yes, the lapis. So actually, the lapis is, so I have, this is the title of next week is the Philosopher's Stone. So lapis is stone, and the lapis philosophorum is the Philosopher's Stone. And so, and what So this would be like the philosophical gold, right? So remember in the spirit in the bottle, the young man is given a rag that will either cure disease on one hand, or it will create rich jewels on the other side. So the lapis would be sort of the material aspect, or the material symbol of this new creature. So you could say, like, if the baby was a symbol of Mercurius, the human, then the lapis would be the material aspect of this transformation. And it's significant that there are two, that this change is taking place both within the soul and the body, like the human being, which that's like so there's like a human aspect of it, that's the health, like the doctors, the physician, the curing the ailments and whatnot. But then there's also this more material transformation. So in other words, it's taking place both in the most kind of base matter, right, just like at the level of the atoms, but it's also taking place in at the level of the highest intellect. So I think that those symbols are meant to represent both the highest and the lowest, if that makes sense. So
Okay, good. On the subject of camera, the etymology of camera is from the Latin chamber and from the Greek vault. So it could also be the container.
I love that, because I've been thinking about it too, in terms of it's sort of it's almost as if it's the self looking on, like it's the objective psyche, right? So, and I like the idea of that being the vault or the chamber, like it's really, you've just blown my mind, because it's like, it's like, it's within this, I don't know, it's weird. It's almost as if the vessel is here, but we can't see it, like, it's very interesting. So thanks for that.
Well, the mind blowing is mutual.
Yeah. All right. No, that's what an honor, to have you say that. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so we have come to the end of our questions and answers. And